thank her for making the journey to come and be with us. And Lauren, I said this yesterday, and I really mean it.
Do not say it again. It was so embarrassing.
Yeah, I know. It's true. I'm just going to have to say it. Just get over it. In the future, we're going to write the history of Christianity in the 20th and 21st centuries. And one key publication out of that is going to be a book that was called Girl Meets God, which was Lauren's memoir of coming to faith. And she generated in that memoir a kind of generous orthodoxy that was being claimed by a younger generation. And in many ways, Lauren held up a mirror that showed the aspirations of churches like ours, that we would be in the present and future continuing to be a place of transformation and of gospel. And Lauren's work since then has gone on. She's done incredible work in historical writing, and her last book, her latest book, is an incredible book, and I look forward to unpacking it. Yeah, exactly. That was a little slip of the tongue there. So I've known Lauren for about 20 years, maybe more, and I'm so grateful for her. And thank you for being here. And with the one thing I would like to say, she's going to speak about prisons and Christ and the gospel and the Bible. And one of the things that I think is such an incredible thing that we're doing these days is we started to do work at the local jail in Oakland County that started with one person, Sarah Prepelek, going forward and getting certified to be a chaplain and visiting there every week. We now have 10 members of this church who are certified as chaplains to work at Oakland County Jail. And my hope is, and we've also had, by the way, parishioners who have spent time not only at the jail but also in the state penitentiary I've gone to visit. So all of these conversations are not of an issue that's far away from us. This is an issue that's close to us. And it's my hope that we can continue to build on this ministry as well. So without further ado, please welcome Lauren Winner.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Does everyone have both a picture of Jesus in red and a handout that says incarceration is all over the Bible? Does anyone else need these? So I was really delighted that Bill asked me to speak about issues relating to incarceration this morning. About 10 years ago, I was in something of really a sort of spiritual crisis. I was in a season, anyone else need a handout? I was in a season where I was feeling intensely far away from God. And it was not a short season. It was not like a month. This had been going on for a couple of years. And I think that very often in the Christian spiritual life, when people have these experiences, and we don't all have them, but a lot of us have them, these experiences of feeling far from God or really alienated from anything that might feel like a vibrant spiritual life, the instructions that you're given about how to like juice it back up are very often very interior. They're like, you should try a new kind of prayer, or you should walk a labyrinth, or you should go on a retreat. They're these sort of interior contemplative piety type things, which are great. I'm all for interior contemplative piety. But I found in my own experience of this season of feeling very far from God and very alienated from a robust spiritual life, that a core thing that drew me back to a kind of vibrant feeling intimacy with God was not learning a new contemplative prayer practice. It was rather going and getting myself involved in the work that God wants us to do in the world. And that happened for me very concretely in the minimum security women's prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. So about 11 years ago, I teach at Duke Divinity School. I taught Mother Imogen there. And about 11 years ago, 2 of our alumni had a vision for beginning to teach in prisons in North Carolina. And their vision particularly was that there would be classes where half of the students are incarcerated and half of the students are coming from Duke Divinity School. And Imogen took one of those classes, right? Or two? One. And the very first course, so the first time this kind of course was offered, it was taught by these two alumni. And they were teaching a course on spiritual autobiography, and they assigned the spiritual memoir that Bill mentioned that I had written, Girl Meets God, and they asked me to come talk about it. And I agreed. It was one of these things where I agreed like 7 months before the event, and then the day of, I spent all day really annoyed at myself that I'd agreed to do this. I felt like I had too much to do. I didn't want to fight rush hour traffic to get to Raleigh. I felt far too busy. I was really annoyed that I had agreed to go speak to this class. And this was, again, in the middle of this season where I was feeling quite far away from God. And I got to the prison, and the classroom at the women's prison in Raleigh is in a trailer behind some barbed wire. It's called the Hope Center. If you can picture, like when middle schools need extra classrooms and they throw up a trailer, it's kind of like that sort of space. And I got there, and I don't want to overstate. I mean, it wasn't like a Hallmark Hall of Fame moment, but it was this 2-hour block of time where, for the first time in what felt like years, I was attentive to other people instead of just being focused on my own, like, morose divorce and depression and what have you. I was attentive to other people. I was somehow able to be attentive to other people in a way I hadn't felt like I had been for a while. And I was present to the present of what was happening, instead of worrying about something in the past or being anxious about something in the future. And I left the class that night, and I said to these two alumni, I think I would really like to come back sometime. So I've now been teaching one class a year in this program for a decade, again, where half the students are incarcerated and half the students come from Duke Divinity School. And it has really been life-changing for me in a lot of ways. As I indicated a minute ago, I think it was really part of my waking up out of a sort of spiritual stupor. It has also, though, really changed how I read the Bible. And that is what we're going to look at for a few minutes this morning. Before having this experience of teaching in prisons and really working quite closely with incarcerated women, I've taught a little bit in men's prisons, but I've mostly taught in this women's prison. I didn't know much about the prison system in the United States. I didn't think much about it. I didn't care much about it. And I certainly didn't have any thoughts about prisons and the scriptures. It had just not occurred to me to put those two categories together. So as I began immersing myself in the culture of this particular prison in Raleigh, I began to realize how saturated the scriptures are by themes relating to prison. And my first understanding of that was realizing that 4 of the 7 letters that we know that the Apostle Paul himself wrote, 4 of the 7 were written when he was in prison. And I began to realize that if you took seriously the location that Paul was in, some of these letters begin to sound somewhat different. So the letter to the Philippians, for example, is a letter that Paul writes. He's in prison in an unidentified imperial city. We don't know what charges he was in prison for. And he's writing to this, Paul doesn't actually like many of the people he's writing to. He has founded churches. He would like the churches to thrive, so he founds a church, and then he sends some letters of advice to the church. But often the Corinthians, for example, seem to think that arguing with one another is like a good spiritual practice and a fun hobby, and they seem like annoying people, or he seems annoyed by it. The Philippians, by contrast, are really his friends. And you read the letters of the Philippians, and he really misses them. And when you begin to realize he is writing from prison to this community of people that he misses, and he's writing a sort of thank you note because they've just sent him a visitor and they've just sent him a gift. And it just takes on a whole different level of meaning when you realize he's sitting in prison somewhere. So I first began to realize that Paul had written 4 of his 7 letters in prison. Then I realized that the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible with its crazy, hard to interpret, apocalyptic visions. I knew that it had been written by someone named John on an island called Patmos. And I think that I always thought Patmos was like a spa, or he was on some sort of extended spiritual retreat. So Patmos was a work camp where people were incarcerated, and the vast majority of them expected to die there. They expected to work themselves to death in this work camp prison. Well, the book of Revelation's declaration that Christ is the King of all sounds a little different if you think someone's on a spiritual retreat being all holy versus if you realize the person is working himself to death in prison and is offering this vision of Christ's kingship. As I note at the top of this handout with this picture of Jesus, there's also a lot of prison in the Old Testament. Joseph, the longest single narrative in the Old Testament is the narrative of Joseph who goes to Egypt. He's in and out of prison, and prison is very significant for his experience. The prophet Jeremiah spends more than half of his prophetic ministry years in prison. Acts of the Apostles became a very important text to me. Acts is, of course, the book that tells us most immediately what the early followers of Jesus did right after Jesus was resurrected and ascended back to heaven. Acts tells us the story of his followers trying to figure out how to be the church now that Jesus was up in heaven. And the people in Acts often get arrested, and they often visit people in prison. And it begins to look like they're taking really seriously the idea that they should imitate Jesus, and that one thing we know Jesus did was get arrested because he was a rabble-rouser, and he was making irksome political statements that were irksome to the empire. They seem to take the concept of imitating Christ to even mean, I'm willing to go get arrested for my faith, and if I don't get arrested, I'm certainly willing to visit people who have been arrested. And then that, of course, brings us to the Gospels themselves. And I used to think that the Gospels were biographies of Jesus. That's what I would have said they were. When you think about it, though, if they're biographies, they're really weird biographies because they primarily focus on the events immediately leading up to Jesus' death and his death. It would be like a biography of Abraham Lincoln just focusing on his years in the White House and his assassination and like having one childhood story and that's it. They're not really biographies. They are depictions of the ministry leading up to his death and resurrection. And they are stories of a person who, central to all of that, gets arrested, gets put through a show trial by the state, and then is killed by the state, is killed in a capital punishment situation. So they could be described as sort of true crime narratives more than biographies. So I began to realize just how central prison is to the experience of Jesus. And this is a good time of year to be talking about this because, of course, we're coming up on Holy Week. And it is Holy Week when we really encounter the specifics of Jesus' arrest and incarceration. So I'm just going to go through a few of the key things that we are going to see during Holy Week. Different gospel accounts point us towards slightly different aspects of the incarceration of Jesus. And I'm just going to go through a few of these, and some of the passages are here on your handout, and I'll mention a few passages that are not on your handout. And as we're going through this, I really want you to either look at or bear in mind this icon. This is a Xerox of an icon that shows Jesus in prison and really spotlights this aspect of his identity as one who is incarcerated. And the Gospels spend a huge percentage of their space on this stuff. It's not incidental. We learn much more about Jesus as an arrested person than we learn about Jesus as a carpenter, or even Jesus as a son of Mary. So I'm drawing here in part, and the book is mentioned on the end of your handout, on a book by a man named Mark Osler. Mark Osler is a former federal prosecutor in Detroit, actually, and he then became a law professor in Texas, and I think he now teaches at the University of St. Thomas Law School in Minnesota. Maybe some of you know him. If you don't know him, you can find his writings in the New York Times and the Washington Post, etc. And he has written a book called Jesus on Death Row, and he just goes through, some of what I'm going to say comes from him, and reads the gospel accounts of Jesus' arrest and death through the lens of our current day American arrest and incarceration practices. And he shows that when you bring questions to bear, how was Jesus criminalized? What was Jesus' experience with arrest? You start seeing a lot of interesting things. For example, you see in the gospel accounts, the gospel writers are very clear to point out that Jesus was the target of an investigation, right? Jesus didn't just happen to get arrested, but those who accused him had a lot of contact with him before his arrest. And we often read in the Gospels that the Pharisees or some other group are trying to trip him up, right? He's the target of an investigation. And during the last weeks of his life, he seems to be under intense surveillance all the time, sometimes by Pharisees and scribes, the religious authorities, but sometimes, as described in the 12th chapter of Mark, by Herodians. Herodians were secular agents of Herod. They were not religious authorities. So we know that he's being targeted and investigated. And then we know that Judas doesn't just betray Jesus. Judas is a paid informant, right? He is a paid informant. As we see on this handout, Matthew 26, one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment, he begins to look for an opportunity to betray him. So in our current criminal justice system, these paid confidential informants often provide the information on which people can get an arrest warrant or a search warrant for someone. Informants are often motivated primarily by being paid, and they have a strong financial incentive to give the government what the government wants to get, for example, a search warrant. Who has already been to church this weekend? Who has heard today's gospel reading already? A couple of us. So those of you who've heard today's gospel reading have actually heard an interesting related piece, and those of you who are about to hear today's gospel reading, I'll point something out to you. So the John 12 passage here on our handout is today's gospel reading. So this is the scene a week before Passover. Jesus is at a dinner party at Lazarus' house. Lazarus' sister Mary pours a pound of perfume on his feet, and the perfume cost 300 denarii, which is about the whole annual salary of a working class man at this time. It's a very expensive perfume. And here is Judas Iscariot, who is at this dinner party. And he says, "You should have sold this perfume and given it to the poor. What's she doing? This is a waste of the perfume." And Jesus rebukes Judas and says, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." So what's happening here? Well, when we read this story through the lens of the criminal justice system and incarceration, we see that Jesus has publicly shamed Judas. He has publicly criticized him. He didn't take him aside. He wasn't polite in his answer. He didn't offer a nice parable that once you thought about the parable, you realized Judas was wrong. He publicly and in a shaming way responded to Judas, and he pissed Judas off, probably. And one thing we know from contemporary criminal justice procedures is that individuals are often motivated to become paid confidential informants against people who have embarrassed them in public. That very often the motivation for deciding to go turn someone in is that that person has somehow publicly shamed you and you are getting back at the person. So we can see that that dynamic is happening in our own gospel reading for today. Once Judas informed on Jesus, we can consider, and again this comes from Mark Osler, we can consider that he wasn't arrested in a disorganized way, but that the authorities pursued a so-called strategic arrest. Right? So if you are being strategic about how you arrest someone, you don't just like send a cop to the person's house at a random time and hope that it goes well, but rather you strategize how you're going to pursue your arrest, and you have some specific goals. You want to get the person arrested. You also hope that maybe you'll collect some additional evidence in the process of doing that. And you also want to minimize the likelihood of there being violence during the arrest or chaos during the arrest. So these strategic arrests are often made at 3 or 4 or 5 in the morning when the person you're arresting is likely to maybe be alone and asleep. And there's an element of surprise, you're waking the person up. And we see this intentionality in the gospel accounts. In a passage that is not in our handout, the beginning of Mark 14, verses 1 to 2, we read that the authorities thought about arresting Jesus at the Passover festival, but, and I'm quoting the Gospel of Mark, they decided not to because they thought his followers might riot. So the authorities are making a strategic decision not to arrest Jesus in a situation where there's likely to be violence or rioting. Instead, they came at night, and we have one of the accounts of that on the handout from a little bit later in Mark 14. This is the story that we ponder during Holy Week, where Jesus asks his friends to stay awake with him while he is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. He wants them to stay awake with him. This is the night before he's arrested, and the disciples don't do it. They fall asleep. And he says, he came and found them sleeping. Are you still sleeping? Enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of the sinners. Immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. So this also gets described in Matthew 26, I think. I love this passage of the disciples falling asleep when Jesus has asked them to stay awake with him. I've always spiritualized the heck out of this passage. For many years, I have thought, I, in my spiritual life, am just like these hapless disciples. You know, Jesus is constantly asking me to, in one way or another, stay awake with him, and I am constantly napping. It just has seemed like a great metaphor for my pathetic and lackluster spiritual life. Now, that's a fine reading. I think it's fine to see this sort of spiritual, deeper spiritual meaning in the passage. But there's a more straightforward reading, which I didn't know until I started learning about strategic arrests. And that is, Jesus was asking his friends to be awake during the time that he knew he was going to be arrested, and they failed. They failed to stay awake during the night with him. And then we see in the end of that passage from Mark that the arresters exactly come when they expect that people might be asleep, and the arresters therefore expect to have a strategic advantage. Also, just notice how many different groups of people and how much weaponry. Here at the very end of that passage from Mark, at the bottom of page 1 of the handout, with Judas was a crowd with swords and clubs. There were chief priests, scribes, and elders. So swords and clubs, this is like the first century equivalent of highly militarized weaponry. This is sort of like the post 9/11 more militarized garb of a lot of our police forces now. These were the equivalent of military rifles. This was serious military materiel. And we learn from this account and from the account in John. John says, so Judas came to the garden guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees, carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. So we get this sense that there are people coming from like many different units. There are Jewish people, there are Roman people, all participating in this arrest. We then learn, this is not on your handout, we then learn that the people being arrested react with violence, as often happens in arrests. We read in Luke, when Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this," and he touched the man's ear and healed him. You'll hear that account from Luke on Palm Sunday next week. So we see that violence is part of the arrest process. And one thing we know from our contemporary criminal justice system is that when an arrest turns violent, it is very often the lowest person on the food chain who gets hurt. A new officer, a patrol officer, a new agent, the person with the lowest status. And that's the person who gets hurt in this situation. It is a slave named Malchus. Simon Peter chops off his ear. So he's an enslaved servant who gets hurt, the lowest guy on the food chain. And then, of course, Jesus heals him. So he's arrested, and then he gets put into the criminal justice processing system. And the different Gospels give us different parts of the choreography, but it is remarkable the extent to which the experience of Jesus in the criminal justice system of the first century mirrors some aspects of what a person in the criminal justice system would experience today. So, first of all, if someone is arrested, I'm sure there are people in the room who know more about this, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. A charge is read and the defendant enters a plea. Often the defendant might stand mute and not say anything at the moment of entering that plea, and then the judge would typically enter a plea of not guilty on behalf of the defendant, and then the defendant moves toward trial. So we see that happening with Jesus in John 18. He is sent to the high priest Annas. This is not on your handout. You just have to take my word for it or crack open the Gospel of John. Annas says to him, you know, you've been charged with blasphemy. Are you guilty of this crime of blasphemy? And Jesus declines to say whether he was innocent or guilty. So it's as though he is standing silent before that charge. Then he goes to trial. And the trial is interesting. The trial has the marks of a lot of contemporary trials. His prosecutor was a guy named Caiaphas. And Caiaphas had a problem that prosecutors today sometimes have, the problem of over-motivated witnesses. Witnesses who, for their own reasons, really want whoever it is to get convicted, and they say whatever they think will most lead to the person getting convicted, even if they're not saying something that's exactly true or accurate. And we read in Mark 14, many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave more false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I'll destroy the temple, and in 3 days build another." Yet even then their testimony did not agree. So you got this clutch of witnesses, each saying slightly different things that Caiaphas has trouble stitching together. And then we get at the top of your second page of your handout in Matthew 26, we get Caiaphas's closing argument, where he seems to be like performing from an episode of LA Law. Like he is going for the high emotion closing argument that he thinks is going to clinch it. He rends his garments. He tears his clothes in the middle of this closing argument and says, "He has spoken blasphemy. Do we need any more witnesses? What do you think?" So, say again. He was doing this in front of the judge. Yeah, right. Then he has an appeal of sorts. So he has this trial, then he has an appeal, and, well, I guess you could, the jury question is an interesting one. You could say that at various points the crowd who gets consulted at various moments is sort of like a jury, maybe. Maybe that's stretching the analogy a little far, but maybe not. He has an appeal of sorts. He's taken to Pilate. And this is when Pilate famously asks him, "Are you king of the Jews?" And he says, "You have said that I am king of the Jews." So Pilate reviews the evidence. And in Luke 23, Pilate says, "Look, I reviewed the evidence on this appeal of sorts. I find no basis for your accusation." And yet he doesn't reverse the decision. And then we could even say, maybe this is stretching it a little bit, but just roll with me. We could even say that Jesus has an experience sort of like a habeas petition, right? A habeas petition is when you would move from one jurisdiction to another, move from the state court to a federal court. And the Gospel of Luke shows that Jesus' case is kicked upward to a different kind of court in just this way. Pilate sends Judas to Herod for further consideration. So Pilate is a representative of Rome, and Herod is a local leader in Judea, so they represent different sovereignties. The habeas petition is not successful. Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate, where there is the famous last-minute clemency hearing, we might think of it as, where there is a tradition that at the Passover, the Romans would release one person who had been sentenced to death. And Pilate doesn't, of course, release Jesus. He releases Barabbas. So there's this elaborate trial structure that's very similar to our trial today. And then you have on your handout next Matthew 27, second chunk on page 2 of the handout. Then we see Jesus being processed as a criminal. Jesus being treated as criminals are treated. He is stripped of his clothes. We know that strip searching is often the very first thing that happens when someone is processed into the prison system. They twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They mock him, saying, "Hail the King of the Jews." And then, of course, there is a sign put over him saying, "King of the Jews." And I think it's really interesting to note that courts in about the last 10 years have begun to experiment with shaming and humiliating signage as an alternate form of punishment. And this has been very controversial among legal scholars. So one example, a couple of years ago in San Francisco, a 24-year-old who'd been convicted of stealing mail was sentenced not to go to jail, not to go to prison, but was sentenced to stand for 8 hours outside of a post office wearing a sandwich board that said, "I stole mail, this is my punishment." Also, a couple of years ago in Ohio, a man and woman were convicted of defacing a statue of Jesus, and the judge who sentenced them did not send them to jail, sentenced them rather to walk through the streets of their town holding a sign that said, "Sorry for my jackass offense." So some judges and some legal scholars are beginning to say this is actually a more efficient and less expensive form of punishment, and we ought to really be exploring this kind of shaming, humiliating public signage. Pretty heated debate among legal scholars about this, but it has this interesting echo with Jesus having this humiliating sign, ironic, of course, humiliating sign, King of the Jews. And then I'll just notice one more similarity between our contemporary system and what Jesus experienced. You have a snippet here of John 19. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them. The undergarment was seamless, woven in one piece. Let's not tear it. Let's decide by lots who will get it. This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, "They divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." So this is what the soldiers did. Near the cross, while this was happening, stood the mother of Jesus, his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. So again, this is a passage that we often, we see it very spiritually, and the text tells us this is happening to fulfill this Old Testament prophecy. That is all true. It is also true that this looks like the practice of forfeiture, where a convicted person loses his or her property to the state. And I think it's very significant that the Gospel of John tells us his family is right there. His family might have wanted his clothes, but he has forfeited, and they have forfeited, the rights to his property to the state. So that was not a comprehensive read, obviously, of the Holy Week story, but I hope it may enable you during this Holy Week to experience Holy Week as you usually do, as an intense and powerful, prayerful, spiritual few days, but also to be listening for the ways in which Jesus is turned into this. Jesus is turned into someone who is marked as a criminal and who is, yes, having a spiritual experience of saving the cosmos through the crucifixion, but is also a participant in the imperial criminal justice system with many parallels to today's criminal justice system. If we had time, which we don't, I would say a few words about how I think this can even shape how we read the resurrection stories. And there's an article by my colleague and friend Sarah Jobe floating around. You can just pick up a copy. It's back there on the table. Imogen has it. That is making an argument that we ought to think about the appearances of the resurrected Jesus as being very similar to what a person who's been incarcerated experiences when they first get out of prison. That's a kind of resurrection, and the experiences are very similar. In my own life, 2 years ago, I was guest preaching at the cathedral in Little Rock, Arkansas, the Sunday after Easter, and I had agreed to do it like a year in advance. No one knew at the time that I agreed to do this that 2 or 3 days before, Arkansas would execute someone. You might remember that 2 years ago there were several men on death row in Arkansas, and there were delays, and then the executions began a few days after Easter. So I went to the cathedral in Little Rock on the first Sunday after Easter. And the cathedral at Little Rock, as you might imagine, is a very politically diverse group. There were people who were like pro bono attorneys there for the death row people. There were also judges who had sentenced the death row people. There was everyone on every political side. The community had been intensely involved in this experience. And I thought, how am I going to preach the story of like doubting Thomas and, you know, the friends of Jesus locked in the upper room because they were scared? How am I going to make that intersect? And then I realized one way of thinking about who the disciples were right after the crucifixion of Jesus. Yes, they'd lost their friend. Yes, their hopes were shattered. They were also a community who had just witnessed a state execution. You know, it wasn't just that their friend had died. They were a community of people deeply affected by this capital punishment of their day. Bill is standing up, so I need to stop talking. Can I say one more thing quickly? Okay, here's my quick last thing. For me, this kind of reading shows me a lot about the Bible. It shows me a lot about the experience of Jesus. But it also shows me something about people who are incarcerated today. And what it shows me is that they know something about Jesus that I do not know. And I don't mean to sentimentalize or romanticize the experience of incarceration, but a key part of Jesus's earthly life was this experience of being processed into a criminal justice system and being incarcerated. There is a woman that I've taught for many semesters now at the prison in Raleigh. She was on death row. She is now in a minimum security prison. I feel sure that she knows some things about Jesus that I do not know, because she has herself in her body and her life had this experience that Jesus had of being on death row. And I really hope I never get to share that experience with Jesus. And it's been a privilege to learn from Miss Barbara about that. But I have begun to see people in our carceral system as actually having a kind of knowledge and wisdom about the life experience of Jesus that I can learn from them about, but they will probably always have a particular kind of intimacy with Jesus that those of us who don't have that experience don't have. I will stop.
Well, thank you so much. We have about 4.5 minutes, and I want you all to know that we all know, and I know more than anybody else, that you are all brilliant. So we're going to keep the questions incredibly short, and we're going to do them all at once, and then Lauren will try to answer. So that's what we're going to do, because I know that many of you are going to have something to say.
This is sort of relevant overall. Yesterday, you talked about how you had a tough time reading the Bible, and then you started doing it. I'm fascinated by incarceration. Who knew? And I heard you spoke about smells. Smells. Who knew? So is this your approach now to the Bible, is to get this kind of focus, and that's how you've gotten interested in reading the Bible more?
Great. And let's keep going. Who else has a question? Okay, Linda. I know, that's a good one. I don't want to, but I want to let you, there's a little softball. They're warming you up.
Thank you.
They're warming you up, Laura. They're going to hit you with some hard ones. Here we go.
I noticed, and this is my own ignorance, I think, but he's arrested by the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, not by the government.
Right. And that's in the Mark account? Which account is that?
Mark.
Right. So I think John says something slightly different. And yes, there is this, oh, I'm supposed to not be answering.
No, it's all right.
I will say that I really struggle with knowing, I think the Gospels depict both some religious authorities and some state agents, collaborating to have this outcome. And I will just acknowledge that my own bias is I am so wary of the extremely horrific history in the church of blaming the Jews for killing Jesus, that I just know that I'm never going to quote, I know it's in there, and I'm going to always want to emphasize, even though there clearly was this collaboration between certain religious authorities and certain government agents, I'm going to want to always emphasize the government agents, because the church has done so much violence to Jewish communities over the centuries in the name of the Jews killed Jesus. And that even, and in this way I think I am faithfully following the Gospel of Mark, I will always say words like religious authorities when describing that. I will never say the Jewish leaders, because I think that just codes us to hear this very problematic long history. We could have a whole nother adult forum, obviously, on the complex history of Christian violence to Jews in the name of certain interpretations of the crucifixion. So the different gospel accounts clearly point to different groups collaborating, and I have my own biases about which to emphasize.
Then Pastor Manisha has one last question, and then we're going to finish there. But would you all please come to the coffee hour where you could ask questions in a more informal venue?
And thanks for just sitting here and listening to me talk for 30 minutes. No one ever does that. That's great.
My question is the question I get asked a lot too, which is how can you compare people who are in the criminal justice system to Jesus, because it is understood Jesus was innocent? And so therefore, you're comparing two different populations.
It's a good question. I'll just say two brief things about it. One thing is that, of course, we do also have innocent people in our criminal justice system, but we also have plenty of not-innocent people. Jesus was innocent of sin. Jesus was not clearly innocent of breaking the Roman law against rabble-rousing, right? And Jesus was not, in fact, clearly innocent. There were charges of sedition. So what was he teaching? He actually was teaching things that were politically seditious. So there's a difference, I think, between Jesus's ontological sinlessness and innocence on that register, and you can be sinless and you can still break a law. So I think that actually the people who are in prison who are innocent have a certain commonality with Jesus, and the people who are in prison who have broken a law have a different kind of commonality with Jesus. It's a great question.
Let's please join me. And John, I think it's such a beautiful question you asked, and I apologize for not spending time on it. But Lauren loves the Bible, is what I could say. Let us all thank Lauren for her incredible talk and generosity.